it's February. It's been warm in Calgary for quite some time now, and I think a lot of us are itching to get into the garden and get going. But is it too early to be talking about gardening? Well, no, it is not too early. A lot of you have probably already started some plants inside, some veggies, some tomatoes, maybe some peppers that are already getting going, and maybe your marigolds are already starting. You've got stuff going. Sweet peas, I heard somebody say today, they've already planted their sweet peas. Maybe a little early for that, but that's okay. We're excited. It's warm out. It's time to start thinking about what's going to happen in the springtime. And now is a great time to start planting your garden, particularly your native plant garden. Because if you're using seeds, some of these require what's called stratification or scarification. And I'll tell you what that is in a second. But the best time to plant many of these seeds that require these special treatments over the winter is in the fall. And just like a tree, the best time to plant it was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So last fall was the best time to plant some of these seeds. The second best time is right now. So you can put some of these things outside, or there's processes you can use inside. What is stratification, you might be asking yourself? Well, it's exposing seeds to a period of cold and wet that helps break through the seed coat. So the water penetrates through this hard seed coat, and it allows for germination to occur underneath. And as that seed starts growing, it pushes open that seed coat. And this is necessary for plants that go through these long winters that we have, because we don't want them to get tricked into germinating too soon. So artificial light, things like that, that might alter the period of growth for these plants won't be tricked in this way, because they have this hard seed coat that has to go through that cold, wet period before it will grow. Things that use this are things like milkweed, liatris, also known as blazing stars, lupins, and three-flowered avens. A similar idea is scarification. So scarification is another way to break a hard seed coat, but it's actually through mechanical means with support from you. You might have heard of things like lodgepole pines that require scarification in order to properly germinate. So they actually have to go through the scarring of a forest fire before they can successfully germinate. That's not the only way to do it. You can scratch the seed coat with sandpaper. You can actually physically hammer on it to break it. There's all kinds of ways. And things like golden beans love scarification, but they also need stratification. So it's not a quick and an easy way to say this one needs stratification, this one needs scarification, and we're good. Sometimes they need both, and that takes time. So now if you haven't planted those in the fall, now is the time to start that process. You're going to want to put those in the fridge for 6 to 8 weeks before they're going to be coming out and actually coming out of that seed coat and germinating. So now is the best time to be thinking about these things. And I'm going to be talking all about native plants today. And why would I want to say native plants? Why can't you just go and put anything in your garden? Well, when we're thinking about enhancing biodiversity in our yards, we want to make sure we're using native plants because they have evolved in this environment and they're adapted to our conditions. And that stratification process is one example of how they've adapted to these areas. They're used to the freeze-thaw cycle of a nice cold winter and then coming into the spring. They're also used to our Chinook conditions, which is hard for a lot of plants that you will buy at a garden center because they're not used to these sorts of conditions where we go in and out of cold and warm all winter long. This is quite an exceptional year, so we're seeing some different things here. They're also a key player in climate mitigation because they're resilient to change. So they're able to take a lot of impact, a lot of different changes on the land and still rebound and remain largely the same. And that's going to be a key thing when we're looking at climate mitigation going forward. They're also drought resistant. They're good at growing in poor soils that we have in our Alberta prairies, all kinds of reasons there. But one of the biggest things is that they have co-evolved with native insects and have important relationships that support biodiversity. Of course, the most obvious one we think of are with pollinators. So there are plants that have very specific pollinators. They must have a long-tongued bee, or they must have a short-tongued bee, or they have to be buzz pollinated. So they actually have to have vibration to shake loose the pollen by a native bee in order to be pollinated. Or we have all of these other different relationships very specific to a particular pollinator. We also have the host pollinator relationship. So we have the yucca moth in southern Alberta, which their caterpillars can only feed on yucca, and in turn, only yucca moths can pollinate that flower. So that's a very specialized relationship. But we do often find that a lot of larvae of insects have to have a particular plant to eat. And then beyond those relationships, there's even more crazy things that go on that we often don't think about. Like up in the corner there, there's a little braconid wasp. So that's a solitary wasp. Once thought to be, not necessarily the best things to have, we now know that solitary wasps are some of the most beneficial things we can have. And they have actually co-evolved with plants so that when plants are being attacked by an insect that might be threatening their survival, they send out pheromones that brings in these parasitic wasps to help take care of the problem for them. So these relationships have evolved over thousands of years, and they're very specific. They also have relationships with the soil bacteria and fungi that support biodiversity. And I'll get a little bit more into that later as well. So, okay, I want native plants. You just told me why I want to put native plants. Is it so simple? Can I just start bringing native plants into my space and boom, I have a garden? You told me they're resilient, they're adapted to this area. I can plant them, boom, garden. Well, yes and no. So yes, planting native plants is going to help you reduce your water usage because they are adapted to our Chinook and dry drought conditions that we have here in southern Alberta. They're lower maintenance over time because you don't have to really do anything with them. Once they're established, they take care of themselves and they help with that biodiversity, like I mentioned, but they also have specific conditions that they like to grow in. So it's not so easy as just going out to our native plant nurseries, picking out a whole bunch of plants, plopping them in your garden and saying, boom, I did it, we're done. Well, no, unfortunately, just like any other garden, we have things that like full sun to full shade. They like dry conditions. They like moist conditions. We do have some Cinderella plants that need very specific requirements. Our Goldilocks plants that have that. They don't want it to be too dry. They don't want it to be too wet. It has to be just right. All of these kinds of things happening. And we also have different roles and companions in the natural world. So you can't just plant things together and assume it's going to be okay. And therefore, you have to think about where you want to put things in your garden and what might work well with others. So how on earth are you supposed to do that? This is all new territory for many people. They haven't had this exposure. They've grown up with all of these plants that you can get at a garden center. So how do you pick the plants that are going to go well together? Well, one of the best things to do is go and take a walk in nature and see what's growing together. That's an excellent way to do it. So if you can find a habitat that is relatively intact and look at what's growing together, that will give you a good idea of these things that might work in your garden space. However, of course, as you can see here, on the left-hand side, that is Ileana rivularis, also known as mountain or river hollyhock, and it only grows native in Alberta in Waterton. That area, if you are not aware, is like a magical little spot in the province, in the southwestern corner of the province, where there's a whole lot of species that occur only there in Alberta. You won't find them outside of that spot. So if you have a chance to go there when they have their plant festival, I highly recommend it because you're going to see things there that you won't find anywhere else. And river or mountain hollyhock is one of those. And so it's growing here beautifully next to that aspen tree. It's like mixed in. There's one spire of flowers. It's perfect, beautiful pink. On the right, it is If I Garden. And you can see maybe it's a little out of hand in my garden. And when I got it from one of our native plant nurseries, and she said, just so you know, they can get pretty big. And I thought, nah, it'll be fine. She was not wrong. It got very big and it has multiplied, which is also funny because I've heard that they are very specific and they actually like to go through forest fires. So after the forest fires in Waterton, if you went down the year or two after that, you were seeing hollyhock everywhere. They like to go through forest fires to germinate, but they also seem to like it just fine and have germinated very well in my yard. So the behavior of plants in the wild is not necessarily the behavior of plants in your garden space. So going out for a walk in nature is not necessarily going to be enough to help you understand what can grow together. Then again, sometimes it is. So these are Canada violets and they're growing in my front yard. And if you go into conifer forests or moist shaded forests anytime in kind of May all the way, they can bloom all the way in through August, you should be able to find some Canada violets. And they grow in these beautiful patches. They spread through seed and they also spread through their roots. And they create these beautiful patches of flowers. And this was kind of like the dream. I didn't think I would actually be able to get them to grow that well in my space because mine's a little bit drier, but they did. And here we go. They're growing just like I wanted them to. And that worked out perfectly. But as you saw in the previous picture, that's not always what happens. So knowing the characteristics of individual plant species is going to help you a lot. And then also understanding not just the soil and sun conditions, but also who they associate with in the wild or who they might crowd out is also going to help you with your garden planning. Think of what you're looking for. Do you like a nice tidy garden where everything has a place and it doesn't move from that spot? Do you like a jungle? Do you like something in between? You can look behind me and probably guess which one is my garden. It's a little bit of a jungle space. I like to encourage as much life in my garden space as possible, but other people don't want that sort of look. They want that nice, tidy look. And so that's going to dictate what you can plant and where you're going to plant it. So let's talk first about the bullies. There are a lot of bullies out there. I shouldn't call them bullies because they're just doing what they do and they're being successful in a space. However, some plants like to be in charge. So this is the view from in front of my deck. This is not where I planted the milkweed. It has decided that it likes it there and it grows there, and I'm not going to be able to stop it. It has told me. So this is growing all along. And then you can also see in the back there, there's some fireweed. These are two plants that like to be in charge. They're beautiful, they're bold, they're big, and they like to be on their own. If you see them in nature, you're going to see them sometimes like showy milkweed. We'll talk about it in a second here, but showy milkweed doesn't necessarily grow as crazy as this in the wild, but it does spread itself out. But it can have some friends along the way if you allow it to. And a good rule of thumb, if a plant has weed in its name, like milkweed, fireweed, it's a safe bet that it's going to take up some space because that's how they get the name weed. They appear in places that people didn't want them or didn't expect them to be. But that doesn't mean that they always take over. Sometimes it does. So fireweed, anybody who knows me knows that fireweed is my absolute favorite plant. I love it so much. And it's a pioneer species and it has a circumpolar range. So that means that it occurs all over the northern hemisphere. Here we call it fireweed most commonly, but over in Europe, in England, they refer to it more commonly as bombweed because after World War II, it was the first plant that came back and established itself after all of those bombs had come through and destroyed everything. So this beautiful pink flower coming up from the ashes of the bombs, so they call it bombweed. Here we call it fireweed because it comes up most commonly after a fire. And it's one of the first species that will reestablish in an area after a disturbance. So fireweed, as you can imagine, after a fire, but that can also be anywhere where you have disturbed the soil. So again, those bombs, or here we get construction, and fireweed is often one of the first things to show up. It spreads by both its roots and seeds and can grow 6 to 7 feet tall. Yes, those ones are probably closer to 8 feet tall, so they can get really high. And they do tend to decrease over time as other plants move in. So they're a pioneer species. They establish first, and then they tend to make way for other things. Except in an urban environment, those other things might not necessarily have the same dynamics as they do in the wild. So they might continue to outcompete. But they're also going to be stabilizing nutrients and stabilizing soil. So they're going to be helping hold nutrients in the soil and stabilizing it for new plants to come in. So it's a great species to have when you're first establishing an area, so long as it's not going to be there forever. I love it. It is actually, you can use every part of the plant for yourself. So you can eat the flowers, you can eat the roots, you can eat the stems and the leaves. You can eat the whole thing. Lots of people use it for medicinal purposes. You can make tea, you can make jelly, all kinds of things. It's also a magnet for bees and hummingbirds. And you can also get hummingbird moths that will use it as a host plant. So It's everywhere in my yard, I admit. I've let it get a little out of hand. And every year I say, I'm not going to let it get this out of hand. And then it gets out of hand. How about showy milkweed? This is another one that is also kind of a bully. So it spreads by its seeds and an extensive root system. So in my yard, I planted it on one side of my deck. It has now spread all the way across and it comes up in our main deck. And it's funny to me. It's less funny to my husband. He's maybe getting a little tired of it, but he has allowed it to be there. But you can cut down the stems that you don't like, and it will still grow in other spots as well. So it's not the be all end all. Asclepias is the genus name for the milkweed that we have in North America. And it gets its name, it was named after the Greek god of medicine. And so you might think, oh, this has medicinal properties. It actually contains cardiac glycosides, which will kill you. So no, don't ingest any of the stuff on here. Milkweed, the name comes from when you crack the stem, you'll see a latex come out, a milky latex. And it does actually have some medicinal properties. So you can use it as a treatment for warts. I have actually done this successfully, so it does work. However, if you use too much, you can cause too much to go into your skin and you might have adverse effects. But this is also the plant that you're going to find our monarch butterflies on. And the reason that they are toxic is because they ingest the cardiac glycosides that are in milkweed and they take that into their own system, making them toxic to anything that eats them. And you can see them in nature, mostly in southern Alberta, far south. So areas like Medicine Hat and Lethbridge is where you tend to find them growing among grasses in the ditches. And they also like to be in disturbed areas. Again, those monarch butterflies are the ones that are going to be targeting them, but they are not the only ones. And they're also not the only milkweed. So not all Asclepias are going to be jerks. Showy milkweed, yes, it likes to steal the show. The name is showy. It's in the name. You can see it's coming. However, we've got other milkweeds in Alberta that are less obnoxious, like low and green milkweed. So green milkweed is actually considered rare in Alberta. So it's unlikely that you're going to be able to find it in a native plant nursery. Probably not going to be able to grow it in your yard. But low milkweed, you can. So Asclepias ovalifolia, so it's also low milkweed and also oval-leaved milkweed, so ovalifolia to the oval leaves. And it's a low-growing one, and it likes moist, shadier habitat, and it doesn't take over. So this is a beautiful little plant. You can see it's got the same beautiful little flower shape as that showy milkweed, but it's much less aggressive and grows well with others. So you can plant it with other things. It's hard to germinate, so I would recommend if you can find it at a native plant nursery as a plug or pot, that's going to be the way to go. But it's also, because of its extensive root system, you're not going to have a very big plant above when you get it as a plug. So the root system grows first and then it sends up its little shoot, but it's not going to be able to grow its extensive root system that it needs to go down with. It's not going to spread out the same way, but it still has to go down. So it is hard to cultivate this plant, and so sometimes it's hard to find. I was lucky enough to get a couple from Wild About Flowers, and I did have it flower in my yard this past year. So I'm pretty excited about that. And all milkweeds are good for monarchs, so you want to have those. But also milkweed bugs, they also need to eat those. And we also have moths that use it. So there's a milkweed moth, and they're a nectar source for a whole lot of other things. I often have different critters visiting them, and hummingbirds also will come to milkweed. There's other plants that will spread. So similar to the way that fireweed and showy milkweed spread themselves out, they also have weed in the name, but they're not jerks. They will share the space. And in some cases, they're actually promoting other things to grow. So the word weed suggests that it's growing and it spreads itself out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it can't share space. So this is something that you're probably going to see in a lot of areas, disturbed areas. You'll often see it at the side of pathways. It's called silverweed. And it's a beautiful little potentilla, so related to our potentilla shrubs that you often find in a lot of gardens. And it's a low-growing ground cover that spreads by runners. So just like strawberries, it sends out those little runners and it can create a nice big mat. Because it's not spreading in the same way with the roots underneath the ground, it often leaves space above where other plants can fit themselves in. And it is actually a member of the rose family. And again, you'll often find it growing in disturbed areas along the sides of roads. And it grows often with strawberries, which is another one that you can easily put in your space that will share. Pussy toes is another one. So here, this is a nice big chunk of pussy toes that I took from a plant rescue. If you are not aware of plant rescues in Alberta, there's a fantastic group, the Alberta Native Plant Rescue Society, that will go out to areas that are about to be developed and encourage people to take as many native plants as they can out of there, whether that is for your own space or for a project that you're working on. You can then take these plants and have like a ready-made garden essentially into this area. Plus you're making it so these plants have another life, which is pretty great. So you can see here that these pussy toes, these are small leaf pussy toes that I got from a plant rescue, and they're certainly not the only thing in there. There's lots of yarrow, we've got anemone, we've got some goldenrod, and there was some local weed in there as well once upon a time. I can't see it in there, but I'm pretty sure it's there. And it will spread by roots underneath the ground, again, to create that mat, but it shares. It shares with others. And it's a perfect prairie plant. It doesn't need a lot of maintenance. It stays low to the ground. It sends up these beautiful flowers. And the reason that it's called pussy toes is because the flowers look like little cat paws. And so if you are a cat fan and you've looked at little cat beans, pussy toes are perfect for you to have in your space. They also encourage a lot of butterflies to come into your area, and they're also great for bees. Again, you can walk on them. You'll find them in fields everywhere, and they're often growing in areas in pasture land. You'll often find them growing underneath the grasses that are there. You might see a mat of pussy toes under there. So it's a great plant to incorporate into your space to stabilize the soil and also share space with others. Strawberry and bearberry. So these are another two that can act as excellent ground covers. So kinnick or bearberry is a plant that is actually an evergreen perennial that it's actually a shrub. So it's not a forb like we would think that it might be. It's actually a shrub, and it spreads again, and it makes a nice big mat over areas. You can often find it on slopes. So it's an excellent soil stabilizer for sloped areas. And it does have a lot of traditional values. It's often mixed with tobacco in traditional ceremonies and smoked with tobacco. But the plants themselves, for biodiversity, those little flowers there are an excellent example of, I mentioned buzz pollination earlier. So these are a plant that needs to be buzz pollinated, and they can only be pollinated by our native bees. So our native bumblebees have to go up into that flower, and they literally have to vibrate the flower to loosen the pollen that's inside of there. And that's the only way it can be successfully pollinated. So pretty cool. And then there's little red berries afterwards. You can technically eat them. If you eat too many, you're going to cause yourself some gastrointestinal or liver problems. So probably don't get too into the berries. But as like if you're walking through the forest and you're like, oh, I want to try one of these, it's okay to eat one or two. Strawberries, on the other hand, these are those magical, tiny little beautiful things, and they are fantastic for ground cover. They spread by those runners, so you can get them everywhere, and they have that space in between that other plants can fit themselves into. And the strawberries are so good. They're better than anything store-bought you're going to find. And this past summer, it was a race between me, my kids, and the squirrels. So we had a race going on between who was going to eat them all, and I ended up with quite a few, I'm happy to say. So I have lots of these things, and they're mixed together as ground covers. So I don't have one necessarily exclusively. I have the pussy toes and the strawberries together, or I have the bearberry and I have the strawberries and the silverweed. I have all of these things mixed together. Nothing has to be by itself. Other plants that are going to grow with the strawberry, the bearberry, and the pussy toes, I said there's other things that will grow in between. There's lots of things. So if you go to any kind of prairie landscape in Calgary, if you go to Nose Hill and you see lots of the prairie smoke on the left-hand side there, this is kind of an extreme patch of prairie smoke. I don't usually find that. It's usually like one or two plants interspersed among either strawberries or silverweed or bearberry. They're usually found within there. So you'll find a lot of the lower growing plants that grow together with these other ground covers, things like those three-flowered avens or prairie smoke or old man's beard. It goes by a whole bunch of different names, which is why I've also put the scientific names there for you, because Often the Latin name is kind of the only sure way to know we're talking about the same plant, Cogeum triflorum. Prairie crocuses are often found growing among these ground covers. Golden beans, the Thermopsis rhombifolia, it goes by several names as well. Goldenrods, a lot of the goldenrods you can get, we have tons of different goldenrod species. Often people think of the aggressive Canada goldenrod. Yes, that one is quite aggressive, but there's lots of other little ones that don't have that aggressive habit, and they will grow nicely with other plants, as you can see here in the right-hand picture. We also get harebells or bluebells, as some people refer to them. Lots of fleabanes, again, that little purple flower growing with the goldenrod in that picture on the right-hand side. That's a little fleabane that can grow with them, and also local weed. And local weed have another special trick that they can help with. So they're excellent in a lot of ways. They can do all kinds of different magical tricks that I'm going to get into now. So local weed is called crazy weed. And the reason that it's called crazy weed is because there's a compound in it that makes it so that anything that eats it goes loco, goes crazy. And so cattle in areas where forage is low will often start picking up on the local weed, and they start going a little bit crazy. They have to eat quite a lot to actually kill them, but it can potentially kill them. If they have other options, high quality options, they ignore local weed. So local weed and milkweed also have been kind of vilified by people because of their toxic traits. However, if given the opportunity, cattle and other livestock ignore these toxic ones in favor of better quality feed if they're available. And they're actually really important because they're part of the legume family. And the legume family has a special ability. So anything in the legume family, that includes beans that we grow in our food gardens, as well as local weed, golden beans, lupins, all kinds of things that we can think of, are nitrogen fixers. So nitrogen fixing means that they have a special relationship with bacteria that allows them to convert nitrogen into a usable form. So nitrogen is a very important nutrient for plant growth. However, plants themselves cannot take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into a usable form unless they have this special relationship with bacteria underneath the ground. So when you put a legume in and it has this special relationship, it's not just going to be beneficial for that plant, it's going to be beneficial for the soil health in general, and it's going to help the other plants around it. How does nitrogen fixation work? So this is an example of a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. So that means both parties are benefiting here. The bacteria is going to benefit and the plant that it's working with are going to benefit. So bacteria in the soil connects with the plant's roots by creating nodules, so those little lumps that you can see on there. And then nitrogen in its N2 form is taken from the air and converted into ammonia, which then reacts to create ammonium that is used by the plant. Some of this nitrogen is then converted by other bacteria, so a third friend comes in, converts it to nitrites and nitrates that can also be used by the plant. And then as these plants start to decompose, they also release that nitrogen into the soil, even at a higher capacity or a higher concentration. So other bacteria in the soil can also take the leftover nitrogen products and through respiration return nitrogen to the atmosphere, completing the full nitrogen cycle with all of this. But of course, when we have these plants that are fixing this nitrogen with the help of the bacteria, again, they're not going to be just using all of that nitrogen for themselves. They're putting that ammonium into the soil, and that can be picked up by other plants around it and offer those nutrients to encourage plant growth with others. So they're excellent to have in poor quality soils that you want to have other plants in. So you don't want to be limiting yourself to only things that can grow in poor quality soil. You want to have your nitrogen fixing plants to help with that. So you can avoid those artificial fertilizers. Other nitrogen fixing plants. So all of those legumes, everything in the legume family has this magical capability. Clovers, purple and white prairie clover, also the lawn clover that you might want to put in your yard instead of grass, that's also a nitrogen fixer. So it's going to enrich the soil around and encourage the growth of other plants around it. Lupins, heady Teddycerum, also known as sweet vetch. Teddycerum, fun fact, is also one of the first things that bears like to go for in the springtime. So if you live in an area where bears may be, just look out. You might be encouraging them to visit your space if you have that Teddycerum. Milk vetch, and also those golden beans again. And that little picture in the middle of the golden beans is, again, not typical of what I find. I usually find a plant or two and they're spread out in a whole area. But last year, for some reason, between the prairie smoke and the golden beans, there were these giant patches of flowers, and it was beautiful. It was absolutely gorgeous. And then once they're done, they're putting that nitrogen back into the soil, again, for other plants to use. There's not just the legumes, though. So other things like alders, which tend to be growing in wet, moist areas. So you tend to find them along areas where, along riverbanks or along wetlands. They're in those areas, and they're also nitrogen fixing. And they're also a pioneer species. So they're coming in after disturbance. They're one of the first things that's going to come in. And they can help create that ideal soil condition for other plants in the successional forest. So just like fireweed, it's the first one to come in, but it's not the only one to come in. It'll create space over time and allow other plants to use that nitrogen and create a beautiful successional forest. But there are some plants, if you don't want to plant legumes in your space, maybe you are concerned about your dog eating local weed or golden beans and getting that toxicity, there are plants that will grow in nitrogen poor soils. Things like bee balm. This one is something that you'll find often in garden centers. You will find bee balm, but you can also find the native bee balm everywhere. So the native one is going to be better than the store-bought one because it is grown in these conditions. It's adapted to here. It's not grown in a greenhouse somewhere, so it's going to be a better fit. Blanket flower, if you go into, again, any prairie environment in the middle of summer and you don't find a blanket flower, I would be shocked. These are everywhere, and they're called blanket flowers because they create these beautiful blankets on the land, and they create this beautiful visual and are very important for a lot of different insects. You'll find beetles on there, you'll find flies, you'll find butterflies, you'll find moths, you'll find bees, all of the things, all of the pollinators love blanket flowers. Goldenrods, they can grow in any kind of soil. Yarrow as well. This is one that people often have a love-hate relationship with because it also spreads by its roots and sometimes shows up where people didn't want it to. I'm actually surprised that nobody has renamed it with weed in its name, but they have not, interestingly. But yarrow is a medicinal plant, so you can use it. I learned last year through using it that you can actually put it if you have bleeding. If you're bleeding, if you cut yourself and you take a leaf and you soak it in some water or chew it a little bit and put it on your wound, it will stop the bleeding, and it does work. So there's definitely some value there, and it has all kinds of other medicinal uses. It can be a little aggressive because it pops up where people don't want it, but it also shares space with other plants. So it's one of those compromising plants. Lance-leaf stonecrop. So this is like a succulent. So this is one that you're going to find in these hotter, drier areas. You're probably not going to want to put it in your garden that gets average moisture and average sun. You want it in the hot, dry spaces, rock gardens in a south-facing slope, those kinds of things. Columbines also do really well. We have yellow columbine, red columbine, and blue columbine that grow naturally in our areas. You can find all three in Calgary, and they are okay to be in nitrogen-poor soils. The red and the yellow are a little bit more tolerant. The blue prefers some rather specific areas to grow in, which I'll mention in a little bit here. Artemisia species are sage, prairie sage, sagebrush. We have actually, I think it's 8 or 9 different sage species that grow in Alberta. I learned this past summer when I was out in the prairies, the northern sagebrush steppe of Alberta and Saskatchewan, how many different sage species there are. And each one of them can grow in these nutrient-poor soils. And some aster species, not all. So if you're going to buy some of these different aster species, make sure you're looking at what kind of conditions it prefers. But nitrogen-fixing bacteria aren't the only type of mutualistic symbiosis happening. We have mycorrhizal relationships, and this is always one of my favorite things to talk about, but I'm not going to dwell on it too much because that's not the focus of this talk. But mycorrhizal relationships are basically between plants and trees and grasses, basically any plant material, and the fungi underneath the ground. And you've probably seen on Fantastic Fungi, or you've heard somewhere about the Wood Wide Web. And that is that underground fungal network that's helping channel messages. So it'll send messages between different plants. It'll help spread nutrients. It'll help spread water. And it connects the forest in a way that we're really only just starting to understand. But they don't all connect in the same way. So it's not like you just plug one in here and then plug it in there and that's boom, we've got this connection. There's different funguses that connect with different plants, and there's very specific relationships. And there's all sorts of dynamics that, again, we're just learning about now. Some of these connections are ectomycorrhizal, so they're connecting on the outside of the roots, and then others are inside the roots. So the hyphae of, so the little threads of that fungus are actually going inside the roots of these plants. So those are called endomycorrhizal. And there's different connections between fungi and other plants, and it's a whole nother topic that one day maybe we'll do another webinar on, and it'll be super fun, and I'll get to talk about all of the fun things there. But this is to say that there's a lot of symbiotic relationships. There's passing of nutrients between plants, and you can use that to your benefit. One of the famous ones that we think of when we talk about mycorrhizae in the natural world is orchids. So orchids are notoriously difficult to have in a garden space. You will find people who have done it successfully, and they will talk about how they managed to transplant orchids from the wild. Please don't. Please don't go and take orchids out of the wild. They need a very specific relationship with very specific fungi, and they tend to do very poorly once they are removed from that space. They also take a long time to grow. So they can take a few years, even more. They could take 5, 6 years before they can actually flower. And a lot of that is, again, developing that very specific relationship. So once you remove them from that natural environment, you've broken that relationship. You've tampered with what's going on even beyond the plant and the mycorrhizae there. It goes wider than that. So please leave orchids where they are. They have this special relationship. Enjoy them where they are, and then go back to your space and enjoy the plants that you have there. There are some other plants outside of our fireweed and our showy milkweed that can maybe be less aggressive than them, but would benefit from some sort of management. So if you have a low maintenance yard, you don't want to do a lot of work, these plants might not be the best for you to incorporate into your space. They have a bit of healthy competition and they're okay. But if they've got free reign, Canada violets, those ones I showed at the beginning that I was saying it did exactly what I wanted it to, they're stuck in that space. They can't really go beyond that. So if I was to have them in a bigger garden space, they might just take over that whole area. Showy Jacob's ladder can do the same thing. Fantastic, beautiful, early flowering little plant. However, it spreads itself very well by seeds and can take over an area. Northern bedstraw is something that you will find very often in our native prairie habitats and in our forested habitats as well. It is something that was used traditionally. You could use the dried stems and leaves to put inside of your pillow, stuff your pillows and blankets with it. That's bedstraw. And it is very important for pollinators, but it spreads by its roots. And if you don't have competition around, it will just get crazy. If there's competition, it plays nice and they all work together. Forget-me-nots, however, the name, they do not want to be forgotten. They spread crazy. It's a crazy spread that they have. I made the mistake of having a bare patch where a couple had grown, and then I left it, and then it just exploded. They're great, don't get me wrong, and I will never forget them. However, you're going to want to start picking some of those out unless you want them to completely take over a space. And then Canada goldenrod. You can see it on the right-hand side there. So this is in the weasel head actually, and it does grow with other things. So there are other plants growing amongst them, but they do create these very tall patches, and they can spread by their roots, and they can kind of outcrowd others. So in your garden space, you either want to give them a lot of space, or maybe don't let them take over. Give them some sort of control. Smooth aster is another one. I see I had a little color issue there. So smooth aster is one, it's beautiful. It grows nice and beautiful and about like 2 to 3 feet tall and has all of these different purple flowers. Prolific bloomer, early to midsummer. Great space filler, grows quickly, does great, but it also spreads by season roots, and it's kind of a jerk. It doesn't share space well. If you want it to share space, you have to put it with other plants that can also compete with it. So on the right-hand side, you can see I've done my best to give it some competition. I've got some sagebrush in there. I've got some goldenrod. I've got some blanket flower. I'm trying to make it so that it can't just take over the whole place. It's possible that it's going to do it anyways, but you can at least try and give it some competition. Things that grow also aggressively and also tall, don't try and outcompete it with things like strawberries or silverweed or anything like that. Those are too low growing. The smooth aster will just take over. Taller plants that also have a habit of spreading themselves can give it the best competition. Yarrow, Anise hyssop, fireweed if you have to go that route. Probably don't need to get that crazy because now you're just introducing some crazy competition in there. But yes, you can rein it in and you can have these things happening in your space. An underappreciated part of the garden, grass. So we often, when we're thinking of native gardens, we want all of the flowers, we want all of the things that are going to make our space beautiful and bring in the pollinators, and we often forget about grass. It turns out that a lot of pollinators actually also need grass. There's a lot of butterflies that use grass as their host plants. And these grasses also play other important roles in the habitat, in the native plant habitat. We've got lots of different native grasses. I am not a grass specialist, though I wish I was, so don't take me out in the field and ask me what something is. I have also underappreciated grass for the longest time, and I'm just starting now to kind of bring that into my curriculum. But I wish I knew more. So why are they so fantastic outside of being able to feed pollinators and take up space in your garden? Well, a lot of them are not the same as a turf grass. So we have mostly clumping grasses. They're not matted grasses, and they have fantastically deep root systems. And when I say fantastically deep root systems, I mean like crazy root systems. Some of them go down upwards of 10 meters. Like that's crazy. I actually read a stat the other day that said that most of our prairie, 90% of our prairie is actually underground. So what you see above ground all of when you're going across Saskatchewan or southeastern Alberta and you're like, oh, there's nothing here. Oh, there is a lot there. You're seeing 10% of what's there. Most of it is underneath the ground. And that visual up above also shows you that it's not just the grasses that have those deep root systems. There's a lot of other plants that also grow those deep roots. And that's going to be really important for accessing water and nutrients during times of drought. And then also helping stabilize soil. So you're preventing that soil erosion, preventing things like dust bowls in the middle of summer, that sort of thing. And on the far left of that image there, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'll just highlight it here. This is your grass. This is turf grass. Look how piddly it is in comparison to these other plants that you can have in your space. If you want to have a resilient garden that can withstand drought, can withstand some heat, and can still provide nutrients for itself, native plants are undoubtedly what you want to have. And again, on the left-hand side there, you can see just how deep those roots go. Imagine the soil stabilization you're getting there. And they also, by having this deep root system that's not spreading out in the same way as turf grass, they're creating those spaces in between where all of those other plants can grow. And it should probably at this point not come as a surprise that some of these grasses also have symbiotic relationships with plants. Many people go out into our mountain areas or in moist areas around the province and see paintbrush. So the beautiful red flower that comes in white, it comes in pink, you can find orange as well. Paintbrush is dependent on other plants. Fun fact, it's a hemiparasite. So it is fully capable of photosynthesizing and doing its own thing. However, it is much more successful if it can team up and steal from other plants. So I'm saying team up, but it's actually stealing. It's just straight up going into these other plants and taking things away. And it does this in a way different to what we were seeing with the nitrogen fixing bacteria, but it kind of looks the same. It looks like those little nodules. In this case, they use specialized structures called haustoria to tap into their hosts and access the water and the nutrients that they have collected. And a lot of their host plants are grasses. Grasses including blue grama, needle and thread, and June grass. So if you want to have a successful growing paintbrush, you want to have some of these grasses in your area as well. And you can see in that picture, there are in fact the grasses growing around it there. Other plants that like to steal from others, they're fully capable of photosynthesizing themselves. They have the chlorophyll, they can do it, but they prefer to take from others, and they're more successful when they take from others. Things like elephant head. This is something you can find in the weasel head if you know where to look. It's often found in moist wetland areas, but it's rare in Alberta. So I say it's often found there. If you're going to find it, that's where it will be. However, you got to know where to look because it is rare. But you can find it in the weasel head, and the name is elephant head or elephant lousewort, and it seems fairly obvious. Those little flowers look a lot like a little elephant head. And it uses sedges primarily. So sedges are, again, wetland plants, so it makes sense that you would find them in a wetland area. And mistletoe. Mistletoe is a hemiparasitic plant. It's not native to North America, but it can take advantage of our native poplars. So I've never seen it in Calgary, but it doesn't mean that it's not here somewhere. And there's also fully parasitic plants. This is my sidebar on paintbrush and all the hemiparasitism. Fully parasitic plants. This is ghost pipe, and this is like one of the craziest plants. So you can see it has no color. It has zero chlorophyll. It is completely incapable of photosynthesizing. So it depends on other plants entirely to get all of its nutrients. It grows in older conifer forests, and it connects to tree roots through mycorrhizal fungi. So it's using that fungi again. It's connecting back into that fungi. So it connects to the fungi, which then connects to the roots of trees. So it's like a double symbiosis that we have going here. It needs that mycorrhizal network, and it also needs the right trees in the area in order to thrive. So in areas where there's heavy logging in old growth forests, ghost pipe populations have disappeared because they can't. Too much disturbed soil, and it's breaking that connection between the mycorrhizae and the trees and the plant. So if you see one in the wild, count yourself lucky. I am yet to see one in the wild, but maybe one day. Super cool. But now, back to the paintbrush. Paintbrush will do fantastically well with the grasses. However, if you don't like grasses for whatever reason, or they're not growing well in your space, there's other things you can use to grow paintbrush in your yard. Things like lupins it can connect into. It can connect into penstemons. It can connect into Jacob's ladder and phlox and violets and wood lilies and also pine trees. When I say wood lilies, this is another one that I say if you see it in the forest, please do not be tempted to dig it up. It has a very specific relationship, again, with the funguses in the soil around it. It does take 5 to 6 years before it can flower for the first time. And if you disturb it, it's going to die. It does not transplant well. Please leave it where it is. So if you aren't growing it from a native plant nursery, forget that one altogether and go with some of these other ones that are going to be excellent hosts for the paintbrush. Speaking of pine trees and conifers in general, there is a thought that they are terrible for growing plants underneath. But that simply is not true, because if you go into our spruce forests in the Weasel Head or any other part of Calgary or even pine forests outside of the city, they're not dead zones. There's other things growing there. They can make friends with other plants. These plants just have to have different requirements than others. So conifer trees are, in fact, water hogs. The idea previously was that their needles are so acidic that it makes the ground too acidic for anything to grow. Nature finds a way. There is always something that will grow. That is not actually the real reason why a lot of plants won't grow. It's that moisture content that they can't handle. So some of these plants are actually fully capable of growing. And if you go into, I keep referring to the weasel head, but that's where I work. So if you go into that area, you will find a lot of these plants growing underneath the spruce trees in the park. And that includes things like fairy bells. And they're called fairy bells because they're these beautiful, delicate, hanging things that look like fairy bells. And after they're done flowering, they grow into this little, if you've ever seen the pink marshmallow, strawberry marshmallow candies, they look like that berries, and they are edible, taste terrible. So I will save you the trouble of trying them. Unless you're desperate in the forest, don't. Just admire them, say, ooh, that looks like a strawberry candy, and then leave it alone. Blue clematis will grow underneath trees. That blue columbine that I mentioned earlier, so it's a little bit more specific than the red and the yellow in that it wants to be in those shady forests with those conifers is where it grows best. Canada violets and also mertensia, also known as tall bluebells, is another one that you can find. So it's not, all hope is not lost if you have pine trees or spruce trees and you want things underneath them. Things grow there. Blue clematis, a little bit more of a highlight on blue clematis and a couple of our other vines that we can find. This is one that you will find only in these conifer forests. You're not going to be finding it growing in an aspen forest. It likes to be in this shady area. It can be a winding one, so it can go up, as you can see, on the fir tree on the left-hand side, or it can trail on the ground, as you see on the right-hand side. And it's often found in a conifer forest. It will climb on deciduous shrubs, so you might find it on a dogwood, or you might find it on a Saskatoon if one manages to grow in these conifer areas, but typically it is associated with these conifer trees. And it's not a space stealer. So you can see on the left-hand side, it's fairly dainty with its flowers and its vegetation. Its leaves are not overtaking that little tree. So it's not going to take over the place. However, there is a vine that will take over the place, and that is white clematis. So white clematis is a little bit more aggressive in its habit. You can find it in places down south, and like writing on Stones Park, you'll find it, and it's beautiful, but it has a habit of growing a little too voraciously sometimes. So you can see this is one of mine. Yep, it's a beast. And again, every year I swear I'm not going to let it do what it did last year. And I let it do it. One of these years I'm going to have to just cut it right back and let it start from scratch. But it does grow really well up the side of houses, or you can put it on a trellis. So I do also have it going over a swing in my backyard. It's beautiful and I love it. And we get tons of insects in there, good insects. So we have lots of bees going in there. We get lots of pollinating syrphid flies, hoverflies, as you might also know them as. Lots of different critters in there and lots of tiny little spiders. So if you don't like spiders, maybe don't put it in a spot where you're going to be sitting underneath, but it's a great habitat. And in the wintertime, when there's no leaves on there, the birds love to use that as shelter. They use it in the summer, but they also use it in the winter. And sometimes it forms little hearts with its flowers like it did here. So I had to put that picture in there. However, it does have that one special little habit that it likes to have cool roots. So a lot of climbing plants like to have cool roots, which means that they like to have things underneath them. So don't have the bare soil. If you're going to have plants around the clematis, that's the spot to have them. You can plant some of those lower growing things. Get some strawberries in there. Get some violets in there. Get some kinnikinnick if you can find it to put underneath there. And then the last native vine that you can find in Alberta is the twining honeysuckle. And this is a beautiful plant. I absolutely love it. It grows best in full sun to part shade. It's also found in mixed shrub and aspen forests. You can find it quite a bit actually in the Weasel Head, and it grows around, it'll either grow on the ground again, it'll trail, or it can grow up and around other plants. It's not going to kill them. It's not going to choke them out like the white clematis just might if it gets the chance. But it does grow really well in these environments, and it flowers, unlike the Dropmore honeysuckles that you'll get from a garden center. It will only flower once per year, and it brings in tons of bees. I get so many honeybees all over this thing. And it's also a great draw for hummingbirds as well. And then afterwards, it gets these little red berries that the birds, I never actually see the berries. They're gone before I see them coming, and then they're gone. The birds love them. Waxwings love them. Robins love them. And I haven't seen who else is picking at them, but I'm sure there's other things going for them when I'm not paying attention. But like the clematis, it likes to have cool feet. So I have mine underplanted with some fleabane, and it seems to like it there. So finding these plants, even the ones that can kind of take up a lot of space above, sometimes you can companion plant below with things that are lower growing and don't require those same don't require a lot of space, and maybe are good with not a ton of sunlight as well. There's a lot of medium-sized plants. So I talked about the big giant plants. I talked about the ground covers. What about all those medium-sized plants in between? How do they all go together? Well, there's lots of plants that are in that in-between stage that are not aggressive, and they're adaptable to soil conditions and sun. So you can kind of play around with them a little bit more. So these are probably the plants that if you want to have that beautiful garden that everything stays in its space, these are probably more where you're going to gravitate to. Columbines, they do self-seed prolifically, but you can control it. They grow quite well with others. They get along. Geraniums, so we have a couple. We have white geraniums and we also have sticky purple geraniums. Both of them make kind of bushier plants, but they can share space. They're not going to spread themselves out and take over the whole area. They can share space quite nicely. Alum roots, so that's kind of the equivalent of coral bells. So if you were going to go to the garden center and buy coral bells for hummingbirds, the native version would be our alum roots, and they also bring in the hummingbirds. So I would recommend having those for you. Heartleaf Alexanders, that's just on the bottom left there, that little yellow one there. It's not like a super attractive plant. It has one of the best names that I like saying all the time in Latin, so Zizia aptera. It flowers in the springtime, and it's just a nice, neat, compact plant. So other things can grow around it, and it's not going to take up the whole area. Blue flax, because it's a self-seeder, it can self-seed itself around. It doesn't tend to take over things. It's also fairly short-lived. So you're not going to have it taking over, establishing its roots and growing and growing and growing. It stays where it is planted, and that's it. It doesn't grow any bigger than that. So it's a nice plant that can go around other things. Same with harebells. They can create these big mats of harebells, but that's usually because there's nothing else in between. They're not spreading their roots out, they're self-seeding. And so they tend to grow up in between other plants. You'll often see them, again, if you're going out in the prairies, you'll see one here, you'll see one here. You don't tend to see these big clumps because they share the space with other plants. Penstemons are another one. There's lots of different native penstemons. The one up there is a shrubby penstemon, but there's lots of different kinds of them that you can get, and they're all excellent for bees. Different bees though, because they have different size flowers and different depths. So you want to make sure if you're targeting short-tongued bees, long-tongued bees, smaller native bees, bigger bumblebees, they're going to be gravitating to different penstemon species. Blazing stars also are not terrible show stealers. They're show stealers in that they're gorgeous, but they're not going to take over the place. They will share that space quite nicely with others, which is really nice and excellent. They make an excellent addition to any prairie garden. They're a little bit harder to grow from seed. They do need that. They like both the scarification and the stratification, but if you can get them to successfully germinate, they're beautiful plants in a nice dry prairie garden, and they grow really well with grasses. So in summary, I've kind of said a lot of things. There was a lot going on there. But in summary, taller plants, probably not going to be the best space sharers. So our fireweeds, our milkweeds, our showy asters, sages, and things can sometimes share space with them, but you need to put all of those aggressive growers together in one space so that they can share with each other and not overcrowd everything else. Root spreading plants, sometimes they will share, like some of those ground covers that we saw, but looking at their natural environment is going to help you understand if this is something that will share space. If you go out and you see a ground cover and it's got no plants growing up between it, probably not the best option for a space sharer. But if you go out and you find all those pussy toes or those strawberries or the silverweed, and you'll see those other plants coming up in between, that's the best ones you can plant to make that nice diverse habitat there. And plants do grow differently in the garden than they do in nature, often because they don't have that same competition, and often because we provide them with more nutrients than they're used to in nature. So you'll find things that grow pretty darn huge in your yard that was like a foot tall in nature, and you're kind of trying to figure out why there's that discrepancy, because you're probably giving it more water, you're giving it more nutrients, and there's less competition probably. Ground covers like kinnikinnick, strawberries, silverweed, and those rosy pussy toes or any pussy toes are going to help stabilize the soil and support the growth of other plants. Nitrogen fixing plants are an excellent thing to bring into your space to help boost those soil nutrients for all of the plants, not just for that one plant itself. So again, that's those legumes primarily, but also alders are a choice if you have a moist habitat. If you're looking at a wetland area and you want to put some plants around, alders are a fantastic option to bring in. Other ones, things like the lupins and the golden beans and the local weeds. Other plants are going to need help from others. So those nitrogen fixing plants, they're asking nothing of the plants around them. They're giving that nutrients to the soil overall. The paintbrush is taking. It's a taker, and it needs those specific plants to steal from, ones that it can connect those hataria into and take those nutrients out of. So those conifer trees, grasses, lupins, again, that whole list of other plants there. And again, what goes on under the ground is mattering for those above ground dynamics. So the mycorrhizal network, the bacterial relationships, all of the things that are going on under the ground are just as important as the things that you can see above. So if you're finding that things are not working above ground and you're concerned there's insects or too much sun or something, an above ground issue, think about what's going on underneath, and then maybe explore those bacterial relationships, those fungal relationships, and also thinking about nutrient content, because some of those ones that like nutrient poor soil, if there's too many nutrients in the soil, they actually don't do well. So there's a lot of different things to think about, but hopefully throughout all of this, you have gotten some ideas. And if you want more ideas or more information, you can go to my website, so growwildyyc.com. The Alberta Native Plant Council has tons of information on their website. And if you want to actually go ahead and buy some plants or obtain some plants, you can go to the Wild About Flowers Native Plant Nursery or ALCLA Native Plant Nursery. The Alberta Native Plant Rescue, again, is a fantastic resource coming up in the spring, and they try to have rescues going throughout the summer wherever possible. And then this year, we are introducing something new where we have multiple weaselhead seed libraries. So we worked with Youth Central to create these beautiful little seed libraries. So if you want to get started from seed on some of these plants, look for that. We will have one outside of our shed shortly. In the next few weeks, I believe it's going up. And you can help yourself to some seeds there and get yourself started.